Some nurses think counting bandages makes them indispensable. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before his entire world collapsed. St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio hums with fluorescent lights and antiseptic sharp enough to burn the throat. The intercom crackles every 90 seconds, code blue, trauma admission, discharge orders, a rhythm Brooke Sullivan has learned to move within like a dancer knows music. She arrives at 5:15 in the morning, 12 minutes before her shift officially begins, because showing up early means fewer questions and less visibility. The parking garage smells like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulances idling 3 floors below. She walks through it with purpose but without hurry, the kind of gait that makes security personnel look past her rather than at her. Her scrubs are regulation blue, no name tag that reads Brooke, just a laminated badge with a photo from 4 years ago when her hair was slightly longer and her eyes held a different kind of exhaustion. The badge photo is not the problem. The problem is that someone might recognize the woman beneath the uniform if they looked closely enough, and no one at St. Michael's has looked closely in the 11 years, 3 months, and 17 days she has worked here. The ICU supply room is her first stop. Shelves line 3 walls, organized by category, sutures, syringes, facets, dressing kits, medications refrigerated in a locked cabinet that only she and the pharmacy tech access. She moves through the inventory with the kind of methodical precision that comes from 17 years of logistics planning, 8 years of it in the Navy, 9 years here in Texas. Counting bandages. Tracking saline bags. Noting which trauma kits have been used and restocked. This is her landscape now. This is her invisibility. Her hands move without thinking. 12 surgical trays need replenishing. The 14-gauge angiocath needles are running low, she makes a note. The bear hugger warming blankets are all accounted for. She turns a box of sterile gloves 90 degrees on the shelf, aligning it with the others, creating a visual uniformity that soothes the part of her brain that still remembers standing inspections. The scar tissue across her left ring finger catches on the box's edge, and she pauses for less than a second, pressing her thumb against the ridge where shrapnel from a collapsed building in Tikrit had embedded itself beneath her skin. Pain is information. That is what her platoon commander used to say. Pain tells you what your body still remembers. Pain reminds you that you survived. By 6:15, the hospital is waking up. Residents drift in clutching coffee from the cafeteria, attendings review overnight charts, and the nursing staff begins the coordinated chaos of morning rounds. Brooke wheels a supply cart into the ICU's main corridor, restocking the wall-mounted cabinets with practiced silence. She moves like someone trained to take up minimal space, like someone who understands that her presence should register as neutral as possible. A shadow in scrubs. A voice that, when it needs to speak, speaks in whispers or monosyllables. Yes, Dr. Caldwell. I'll check that, Dr. Caldwell. Right away, Dr. Caldwell. The grand rounds begin at 7:30 in the main conference room on the 4th floor. 15 residents and attending physicians gather around a central table where Dr. Caldwell stands with the posture of a man who has never questioned his own importance. He is tall, 6'2", with the kind of tailored appearance that expensive suits provide. His watch is a Rolex, platinum band, the kind that costs more than Brooke makes in 3 months. He has been the chief of surgery at St. Michael's for 9 years. He has published 43 peer-reviewed articles. His name appears on the masthead of the hospital's Surgical Excellence Initiative. He is, by every institutional measure, indispensable. Brooke is not supposed to be in the conference room during grand rounds. She should be in the ICU, restocking and monitoring and maintaining the invisible infrastructure that keeps the hospital running. But Dr. Caldwell's voice rises above the clinical discussion, and it carries through the open doorway into the corridor where she is hanging fresh for tubing on the cart. Someone, Dr. Caldwell announces, has been making inventory notations that would embarrass a first-year nursing student. The residents laugh. It is the kind of laughter that sounds practiced, as though they have learned which of Dr. Caldwell's remarks require audible approval. Brooke's hands continue moving, clip, arrange, restock, with no change in pace or pressure. Dangerously inadequate documentation, Dr. Caldwell continues, holding up a clipboard. It is her clipboard. Her handwriting. This level of carelessness could cost lives. Or expose this hospital to liability. Or both. She does not know how long she has been standing motionless, the foot tubing still in her hands. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead with their mechanical insistence. A monitor in the ICU behind her beeps in steady rhythm, the sound of a stable patient, O2 saturation right where it should be. Her jaw tightens imperceptibly. Her breathing remains even. She has survived worse than this. She has attended to colleagues who were bleeding out on desert sand while incoming fire chewed up the walls around them. She has held a man's spine together with her hands while a corpsman called for a medevac. A man's mockery in a conference room is not a threat. It is merely noise. If your charting is this poor, Dr. Caldwell says, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from knowing there will be no consequences, I suggest you reconsider your career path. Nursing is a profession, not a fallback. The laughter continues. Residents shift in their seats, eyes down on their own documentation as though the comment might somehow contaminate them if they make eye contact with the implied target. Brooke sets the four tubing down on the cart with deliberate care and returns to the supply room. The incident takes 6 minutes to pass, 6 minutes of invisible time in which she catalogues the content of Dr. Caldwell's remarks, the medical implications of his publicly undermining a staff member, the way institutional power flows downward like gravity. She understands power structures the way a sailor understands currents. She knows how they move, how they break, what happens when you fight them directly. That night, after her 12-hour shift, Brooke sits alone in the break room on the 3rd floor. The room is small, 2 vending machines, a refrigerator that smells like forgotten yogurt, a single table with 4 chairs that no one bothers to use. The fluorescent lights hum their continuous monotone. Outside the windows, San Antonio spreads across the darkness, streetlights reflecting off the Riverwalk 2 miles south. She should go home to her 12-year-old son, Marcus, who is with her mother until 9 o'clock. Instead, she sits at the table with her hands folded, and she takes out the tarnished challenge coin from her scrub pocket. The coin is small, about the size of a quarter, heavier, and its surface is worn almost smooth from 17 years of rotation between her fingers. On one side, an eagle perched above a trident and shield. On the other, words that she no longer needs to read because they have been pressed into her muscle memory: Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6, graduated 2006. The coin's tarnish is not accidental. She has never polished it. The oxidation is part of its honesty, part of its refusal to gleam the way new things do. This coin is proof. This coin is the only object that testifies to who she was before San Antonio, before nursing school, before invisibility became her strategy and her shield. Her left ring finger aches slightly. The scar tissue always aches in the evening when she is tired. In Tikrit, during the operation that made her disappear from the Pentagon's official records, she had been the one closest to the building when it shifted and came down. Shrapnel had embedded itself in her finger, her shoulder, the soft tissue above her collarbone where her tactical vest had not covered. The medic had extracted what he could with tweezers and a headlamp while she lay on her stomach and did not flinch. The remaining fragments had calcified beneath her skin, a private reminder of a mission that was never officially acknowledged. She turns the challenge coin over in her palm once, twice, 3 times. The repetition is meditative. The movement is something to do with her hands while her mind processes the risk that Dr. Caldwell represents. He does not know who she is. He sees a quiet nurse with steady hands and obsessive attention to inventory detail. He does not know that her obsessive attention to detail comes from 11 years of training and 4 years of operational planning. He does not know that her inventory discrepancies are not careless mistakes but deliberate documentation of something far more serious than his mockery. The supply orders have been wrong for 6 weeks. Not slightly wrong, systematically wrong. The quantities listed on purchase orders do not match the quantities actually used in surgical cases. The variance is approximately 12%, which on a $50,000 monthly supply contract translates to roughly $6,000 per cycle. Someone is skimming. Someone is inflating orders, pocketing the difference, splitting the profit with an inside contact at the supplier. And Brooke has been documenting every discrepancy in her meticulous, impossible to refute handwriting, building a record that will eventually require institutional attention. Dr. Caldwell is the only person with access to those purchase orders. Dr. Caldwell is the only person with authority to approve quantities that large. Dr. Caldwell is the only person who benefits from the arrangement. She does not yet know if he understands what her documentation means. She does not yet know if he realizes that her invisible presence in the ICU, her obsessive restocking, her careful notation of every missing item, has already begun the process of exposing him. But his voice in the conference room had carried a new edge, a subtle threat beneath the mockery. Some nurses think counting bandages makes them indispensable. It was not a throwaway insult. It was a warning. It was a man recognizing that his position was threatened and beginning to respond. The challenge coin turned slowly in her palm. The lights hum overhead. Somewhere in the hospital, patients sleep and machines monitor their vital signs, and the invisible infrastructure that she maintains continues its work. She thinks about her son, about the life she has built here, about the version of herself that exists only in erasure and silence. She thinks about what it means to have spent 17 years in service and 9 years building a new life that requires her to be smaller than she actually is. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to begin. The vending machine hummed its fluorescent song as Brooke fed a dollar bill into the slot, her movements precise and economical. 7:52 in the morning. The day shift was still quiet, most of the residents still upstairs finishing their overnight notes. She pressed the button for black coffee, nothing added, nothing complicated. The mechanical spiral turned. The cup dropped. Sullivan. She didn't turn around. The voice behind her had that particular texture of controlled rage, the kind that came when someone's authority was being questioned in ways he couldn't immediately silence. Dr. Caldwell stood 3 feet away, his white coat pristine, his expression arranged into something that looked like concern but felt like a blade. "Coffee?" he asked, voice pitched loud enough to carry down the corridor. "Or are you grabbing pills to slip into patient 4s? Nurses who think they're doctors tend to experiment." Brooke retrieved her cup. The liquid inside was black as oil. She said nothing. "I'm talking to you." Caldwell stepped closer, his presence suddenly demanding, the kind of attention that made the air pressure change. "You flagged 17 supply orders in the last 60 days. 17. You understand that's not your job, correct? You're a bandage counter. You restock carts. You don't audit procurement." His voice dropped lower but didn't soften. "Nurses who think their doctors are dangerous, Sullivan. To patients. To themselves. To this institution. You learn your place or I'll have security escort you out of this hospital in front of everyone you've worked with for 9 years. Do you understand me?" Her knuckles whitened around the coffee cup, but her face remained perfectly still. Not a flinch. Not a blink. Her jaw tightened once, imperceptibly, the only crack in the composure, but her hands remained steady. She nodded once, slow and deliberate, and turned away without a word. The corridor stretched before her, and she walked it like a woman moving through water, her scrubs whispering against her legs with each step. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. The smell of antiseptic followed like a ghost. What Caldwell didn't see, what no one at St. Michael's could have known, was that the tension in her jaw wasn't fear. It was restraint. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was 17 years of muscle memory being held in place by sheer will, by the understanding that she had chosen a different life, a smaller life, a life where she didn't break people who needed breaking. She returned to the supply station on the east corridor, where inventory sheets waited in neat stacks and 4 bags stood in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. Her hands moved through the motions, checking counts, verifying serial numbers, recording everything in the meticulous documentation that had become her armor. Each note was precise. Each entry exact. The supply chain defects continued to accumulate in her charts, invisible to everyone except someone who knew how to read them. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Caldwell sat across from Karen Mitchell, the hospital administrator, in her office on the 3rd floor. The Venetian blinds cast shadows across his face like prison bars. He had learned a long time ago that direct assaults could be traced, documented, investigated. But this was strategy. This was the way powerful men moved through institutions. "I have concerns about Nurse Sullivan's clinical judgment," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone genuinely troubled. "She's been reassigning herself to different units, interfering with supply orders, and maintaining documentation that doesn't align with standard protocols. I've tried to mentor her, but I'm beginning to wonder if she's stable." He paused, letting that word settle like sediment. Stable. 3 times she's questioned my clinical decisions during rounds. A good nurse knows her scope. She's operating outside it. Karen leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. She'd worked with Caldwell for 8 years. He was brilliant. Prolific researcher. Fundraiser. He wouldn't raise concerns without substance. "I'm planning to draft a formal documentation request," Caldwell continued, asking her to justify her intervention in supply procurement. "If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to worry about, right? But I wanted to brief you first. Cover the hospital's liability. She's been volatile, and I'd hate for there to be an incident that we should have seen coming." The words were perfect. Each one placed like a chess piece. Not an accusation. A concern. Not a demand. A suggestion. Not a trap. Protocol. Karen nodded slowly. "I appreciate you bringing this forward. Let me review her file." Caldwell left her office knowing exactly what would happen next. The wheels were already turning. Investigations would be opened. Questions would be raised. By the time Brooke even understood she was under scrutiny, the narrative would already be set. He walked down the hallway with the smile of a man who had learned long ago that institutions were fragile things, and the people who controlled the narrative controlled everything else. Meanwhile, Brooke stood in the pediatric ward on the 5th floor, where she'd been reassigned that morning at the nurse's station, announced publicly so everyone could understand the recalibration of her status. "Sullivan needs simpler tasks until she learns proper documentation," Caldwell had said, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor. Her colleagues had looked at their shoes. The message was clear. She was being isolated. She was being marked. The pediatric ward was its own world. Small beds with cartoon rails. Monitors that beeped in different tones than the ICU, higher pitched, more anxious. She checked on a 4-year-old with pneumonia, her hands moving with the same precision she'd used everywhere else. The girl's mother watched her with quiet gratitude, unaware that she was watching someone whose hands had once held lives together in ways that couldn't be mentioned. By evening, Brooke sat alone in the break room, the one in the basement that no one used after the day's shift ended. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. The smell of stale coffee and microwave popcorn hung in the air. She pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her pocket and turned it over in her palm, watching the light catch the worn edges. The coin had been struck from aircraft wreckage after an operation in Tikrit in 2008. One side bore an eagle and an inscription so faded it was almost illegible: "Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, Special Forces Command." The other side held a date. The last date her real name had been used in any official capacity. 17 years ago. She allowed herself one breath that shook slightly, just enough to prove she was still human, still capable of feeling the weight of being pressed down by someone who had no idea what he was pressing. Then she straightened. The coin went back into her pocket. Her shoulders reset. The mask slipped back into place like a helmet clicking into position. She didn't know it yet, but the worst was still coming. The crisis that would arrive at 11:48 p.m. The moment when muscle memory would override 9 years of carefully constructed invisibility. The second when everyone would finally see what they'd been standing next to the entire time. But for now, in the quiet of the break room, she was just a nurse who'd been publicly humiliated, reassigned, and isolated. Just someone trying to hold a line between who she used to be and who she was allowed to become. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a secret that couldn't stay buried much longer. At 11:27 p.m., the ICU doors exploded inward. The man was 6'7", maybe 280 pounds of muscle and meth-fueled rage, his pupils dilated so wide his eyes looked like black holes. His name was Marcus Reeves, though nobody would remember that later. What they would remember was the sound, a roar that didn't come from his throat but from somewhere deeper, primal, the kind of noise that made every mammal in the building understand that something had broken loose. "I need Dilaudid. Now. I'm in pain. Give me the fucking Dilaudid or I'll." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. His fists were already clenched, his movements jerky and electric. The smell hit the ICU first, unwashed skin and methamphetamine sweat, sharp and chemical, cutting through the antiseptic fog that usually owned that space. A resident named Dr. Patterson, maybe 28 years old, 3 months out of med school, tried to de-escalate. Wrong move. Reeves turned, grabbed the kid by the collar, and drove him backward into the wall with the kind of casual violence that only meth and brain damage could produce. Patterson's head cracked against the monitor mount. The impact made a sound like a dropped watermelon. His vision went white. He slid down the wall, breathing in shallow gasps, vision swimming. That was when Reeves saw the crash cart. The scalpel was sitting right there, part of the emergency surgical kit, because ICU protocol meant being ready for everything. He grabbed it, a number 15 blade with a handle smooth from 10,000 procedures, and turned toward the nurse's station. The other staff scattered like birds. A nurse named Jennifer ran for the trauma bay. The charge nurse, Marissa, grabbed the phone to call security, her hand shaking so badly she hit the wrong extension twice. The phlebotomist who'd been drawing lab simply left, cart and all, moving backward toward the stairwell. Everyone had the same thought: get distance. Get to a locked door. Get away from the man holding a scalpel in a hospital gown that gaped open in the back. But Brooke Sullivan didn't move. She was standing near the 4 pump station, 3 feet from the desk where the med syringe driver showed 50 milliliters per hour of propofol. She didn't run. She didn't back away. She turned, made direct eye contact with the man advancing toward her with a 4-inch blade, and something shifted in her posture. It was subtle, the way her shoulders squared. The way her breathing changed. The way her feet settled into a stance that suddenly made sense only if you knew what to look for. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice anyone at St. Michael's knew. It was low. Flat. The kind of tone that bypassed ears and went straight to the lizard brain. The kind of voice that had cleared compounds in Tikrit. That had whispered extraction coordinates into a radio while insurgents fired from 3 directions. That had talked a 17-year-old kid with an AK-47 into putting the weapon down. Put the blade down. Now. You have one chance. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of physical fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had already calculated every variable and found them all favorable to her outcome. Reeves hesitated. That was his first mistake. The hesitation meant he was hearing something in her voice that contradicted what his eyes were telling him. His eye said, thin woman, 5'8", maybe 140 pounds, hospital scrubs, no visible weapon. His ears said, apex predator. He lunged anyway. His body moved, scalpel first, committed to violence. And that was when Brooke's 12 years of Special Forces training didn't emerge, it didn't awaken or activate or any of those words people used when they didn't understand muscle memory. It was simpler than that. Her body did what her body had been trained to do 10,000 times on mats and in compounds and in dark rooms with instructors who believed that hesitation was the same as death. For seconds. That's how long it took. First second, she pivoted her hips 45 degrees, letting the blade pass through the space where her torso had been. The scalpel whistled past so close she heard the pressure wave. Her right hand went open palm up, striking his wrist from the inside. The blade fell. She heard it hit the floor before she heard him gasp. Second, her left arm was already moving, elbow driving up in a controlled arc, aiming for the junction of his jaw and neck. She didn't go for the kill, she didn't need to. She needed him disabled and compliant. The impact made a sound like a bat hitting concrete. His momentum carried him forward into her hip. Third second, she had already pivoted, was already moving behind him, her left forearm wrapped around his right arm, her right hand pressing up on the back of his neck. The position was called a rear control hold, and it looked from the outside like she was hugging him from behind. From the inside, it was inescapable. His arm was locked. His neck was pinned. His body had no leverage, no escape angles, no vector of resistance that mattered. Fourth second, she was already moving him, steering him toward the wall, controlling his balance, and her right hand was already reaching for the medication cart where a 10 milligrams vial of midazolam sat in the stat drawer. She used one hand to draw up the dose, practiced, efficient, her movements economical. The syringe filled with 2 milliliters of sedative. She found his arm, the one she wasn't controlling, felt for the antecubital fossa, and drove the needle in with the confidence of someone who had done this in sandstorms and blackout and under incoming mortar fire. The push was clean. For confirmed. Medication in. "You're going to sleep now," Brooke said. Her voice was still that same flat tone. "Stop fighting. You'll wake up in recovery. The pain will be managed." Reeves' eyes were starting to glaze at 30 seconds. Confusion was setting in. The sedative was crossing the blood-brain barrier, flooding his system with the chemical equivalent of an off switch. His breathing slowed. His resistance faded. By 60 seconds he was barely conscious, his body limp against hers. Security arrived just as she was lowering him to the floor with controlled precision, his airway clear, his breathing unlabored. The two officers, Jackson and Rivera, both former military, looked at Brooke, then at the scalpel on the floor, then at Dr. Patterson sliding down the wall, then at the man unconscious in Brooke's arms. The first thing Rivera said was, "Jesus Christ." The second thing he said was, "Call Dr. Caldwell. He needs to know we have the situation contained." That was the moment the cameras stopped recording heroics and started recording liability. That was the moment a save became a scandal. Because Dr. Caldwell had been sitting in the physician's lounge, scrolling through his phone, when the overhead alert came through. Code. ICU. Physical threat. And he had smiled. He had actually smiled, because this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment Brooke Sullivan, who'd been quietly dismantling his fraudulent supply contracts with her obsessive inventory checks, made a decision that could be reframed as reckless. Excessive. Dangerous. He watched the security footage 3 times. The first time, he felt a flash of genuine surprise. The woman moved like she'd done this before, like she'd done this a lot. But the second time through, he noted the exact moment she struck Reeves, the moment the blade fell. The third time, he was already composing the narrative in his head. Excessive force. That was the angle. Not the heroics. The force. By 11:59 p.m., he'd made 2 calls. The first was to James Henderson, the hospital board president, waking him at home. It was nearly midnight, but this was important, this was urgent. "We have a liability situation. One of our nurses assaulted a patient. Uncontrolled response. Sedation without physician orders. We need an investigation, and we need legal to know immediately." The second call was to Patricia Reeves at her home, no relation to the MMA fighter, just coincidence, an HR investigator he'd used before, a woman who understood how to document things retroactively. "I need you at St. Michael's first thing. Excessive force incident. Nurse named Sullivan. I'm sending you the footage and the resident's statement. I need a termination case ready by end of business tomorrow." He didn't mention that Brooke had saved the department from a violent patient. He didn't mention that Peterson would have gotten his head split open without her intervention. He mentioned only what he needed to mention: force, sedation, liability. By 6:11 a.m., when Brooke arrived for her morning shift, she found 2 security officers waiting at the employee entrance. The lead officer, a man named Chen, wouldn't make eye contact with her. Ms. Sullivan, you've been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Your badge and access card are being revoked. You'll need to speak with HR before you leave the building. The words came at her like they belonged to a language she'd almost forgotten. Suspension. Investigation. Revoked. She'd heard variations of these words in courtrooms after operations went sideways, in briefing rooms when interrogations got recorded, in cold sterile offices where classified files were burned. But not here. Not at St. Michael's. Not from people she'd worked beside for 3 years. She turned in her badge at the security desk. She watched it disappear into a drawer. She signed paperwork in triplicate. Patricia Reeves, the investigator, gave her a noncommittal nod and said something about cooperating with the investigation and a legal counsel might advise against further statements. They escorted her out at 7:15 a.m., during shift change, which meant she walked past every nurse she'd worked with. Everyone knew. Everyone had heard the version where she'd overstepped. Where she'd sedated a patient without orders. Where she'd used excessive force on someone who was already incapacitated. No one had heard the version where 4 seconds of trained precision had prevented deaths. The morning rain hammered the parking lot like bullets on a tin roof as she walked to her car. Her phone buzzed, a text from her ex-husband about their son's soccer practice. Another text from Jennifer the nurse, just saying, "I believe you." Then nothing else, because what else was there to say? She drove home on autopilot. Her son, Daniel, was 12 years old and still in elementary school because his birthday fell in September. He was supposed to be at his father's house. He was supposed to be at school. But when Brooke opened the door at 3:36 p.m., he was there on the couch, still wearing his school uniform, his backpack unopened on the coffee table. "Mom." His voice had that confused note kids get when the world suddenly stops making sense. "Why are you home? Are you sick?" She couldn't answer. She sat down at the kitchen table, her hands shaking in a way they never shook during emergencies, during violence, during the moment when everything was on the line. This was different. This was the shaking of something breaking down from the inside. She pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her pocket, the same coin she'd been turning over all night, and pressed it into her palm so hard it left a mark in the shape of an anchor and the number 2009. "Daniel, go to your room for a little while." "Mom, what?" "Please." He went. And she sat alone at that table, her jaw locked tight, her breathing controlled, everything she'd been trained to do to survive utterly useless against the reality that she couldn't fight this. She couldn't solve it with muscle memory or combat training or the 1,000 small skills that had kept her alive in Tikrit and 3 other places she wasn't allowed to discuss. She could only sit here and wait for the truth to become irrelevant. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was already happening in Dr. Caldwell's office, where the files on Brooke's supply discrepancies, the evidence of his fraud that had taken him 8 months to compile, were being fed one by one into a shredder. The worst part was the phone call he was about to make to the medical supply company, letting them know that the woman who'd been tracking their kickback scheme was no longer employed by the hospital. The worst part was the simple mathematics of relief: her badge was gone. Her credibility was destroyed. Her inventory checks would be forgotten by next week. The worst part was that he'd learned something important, that in an institution built on hierarchy, one moment of perceived overreach could erase 3 years of meticulous, honest work. The worst part was that he was already walking back to his office, already scheduling the next shipment of overstocked supplies, already planning how to make up for the revenue he'd lost while Brooke was watching. And he had no idea that everything he'd just done was being saved. Every phone call to the board president. Every conversation with the investigator. Every edit of the security footage that showed violence without context. All of it was being archived by a systems administrator named Mike Halloway, a former Navy Master-at-Arms, who'd been sitting in his IT office when Jackson the security guard mentioned what had happened in the ICU. Halloway had pulled the unedited footage. He'd seen all for seconds. He'd seen the man lunge with a blade. He'd seen Brooke stop him. He'd also seen Dr. Caldwell walk into the administrator's office at 6:18 a.m. with a USB drive, and he'd seen exactly what Caldwell was trying to accomplish. Holloway had been in the Navy for 22 years. He understood oaths. He understood institutional accountability. And he understood that sometimes the worst thing a person could do was nothing. But Brooke didn't know that yet. All she knew was the kitchen table. The challenge coin. Her son in the other room. And the absolute certainty that the truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the narrative, and the narrative was already written. Dr. Caldwell watched the security footage 3 times. Once at normal speed. Once in reverse. Once frame by frame, his Mont-Blanc pen tapping against his desk with increasing precision. The 6'7" attacker. The stretcher. The resident flying backward like a ragdoll. And then Brooke Sullivan stepping directly into the path of a man holding a surgical scalpel, her voice dropping into a register that didn't belong to any nurse on his staff. He didn't see a crisis averted. He saw an opportunity. The attacker lunged. She moved. For seconds. The scalpel clattered. The man went limp. It was flawless. Surgical. Practiced. Which meant it was classified, which meant it was something the hospital's board president needed to know about immediately, which meant it was exactly the leverage Dr. Caldwell had been waiting for since the day Brooke's meticulous inventory audit started creating discrepancies in his procurement records. He picked up his office phone at 11:41 p.m. and dialed the board president's home number. "Marcus, this is Richard Caldwell. I apologize for the hour, but we have a serious liability situation at the hospital. One of our nursing staff employed an excessive use of force against a psychiatric patient this evening. I'm concerned about her stability, her judgment, and frankly her fitness for patient care." "Yes." "A nurse. Her name is Brooke Sullivan. No prior incident reports, but that's precisely what concerns me. We may not be seeing the full picture. I've already contacted an external HR investigator. I want a thorough background check. There are questions that need answering." He paused, listening to the board president's response, his jaw tightening with satisfaction. "Thank you. I'll coordinate with the investigator first thing in the morning." The second call came at 12:15 a.m. The hospital at San Antonio where Brooke had worked before St. Michael's. The HR director picked up on the 4th ring, confused and defensive at the late call. "This is Dr. Richard Caldwell, Chief of Surgery at St. Michael's Hospital. I'm calling regarding a former employee, Brooke Sullivan. She's applied for a sensitive position here, and I'm doing reference checks. Can you tell me about any behavioral incidents? Violent tendencies? Anything concerning?" He waited as the HR director fumbled through old files, her voice uncertain. "I see. And in her 7 years with you, nothing? No flags at all? That's interesting. It's just that we had an incident tonight where her response was disproportionate. Concerning. I'm trying to determine if this is a pattern or an isolated event. I understand confidentiality. I just want to make sure we're not missing something. Thank you for your time." The third call was to Patricia Reeves, an outside HR investigator he'd retained through a personal contact 2 years ago. She specialized in building documentation for difficult terminations, the kind that stood up to legal challenges because everything was bulletproof. "Patricia, I need you at St. Michael's first thing tomorrow morning. We have an employee who committed an assault on hospital property. A nurse. Brooke Sullivan. Yes, she stopped a dangerous patient, but her methods were excessive and unsanctioned. She administered medication without authorization. She took matters into her own hands. I need a thorough investigation built for a termination case. I need it ironclad. Can you start interviews with the ER attending and the resident who witnessed the incident? I want statements about her demeanor, her language, any sign of instability. Build the file. I'll have her badge suspended pending your findings." By 7:36 a.m., before the morning shift began, Brooke's access card stopped working. The badge scanner at the staff entrance rejected it with a soft red light and a mechanical click. She tried again. Same result. A security guard she didn't recognize was suddenly very interested in her presence in the hallway, his radio crackling with static that sounded like her name. "Miss Sullivan, you're going to need to come with me to HR. There's been an administrative decision." The termination meeting lasted 17 minutes. Brooke sat across from Patricia Reeves in a conference room with walls the color of institutional beige, her name printed on a termination letter that cited excessive use of force and unauthorized administration of controlled substances. Her badge was revoked. Her access to all hospital systems was disabled. She was suspended pending a formal investigation that would take 6 to 8 weeks. She was instructed not to contact patients, staff, or physicians. A security escort would be arranged if she attempted to return to the building. Brooke signed the letter with the same steady hand that had disarmed a man with a scalpel 16 hours earlier. "I understand," she said, her voice level and distant, the voice of someone speaking from behind reinforced glass. She walked out of St. Michael's at 8:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, her employee ID gone, her access gone, her position gone. The morning light hit the parking lot in harsh white blocks. A vendor was setting up a coffee cart near the emergency entrance, the smell of burnt grounds and cinnamon rolls drifting across the asphalt. Somewhere in the hospital, the patient she'd saved was recovering. The ER team was moving to the next crisis. Dr. Caldwell was already back in his office, fielding calls from the board president about the situation, his voice full of grave concern and administrative competence. Brooke drove home in silence. No radio. No podcasts. Just the sound of the air conditioning cycling and the occasional horn from another driver who'd cut her off without seeing her. Her son was at school. He wouldn't be home for 6 more hours. Brooke sat at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her, the screen showing 17 messages from co-workers asking if she was okay, if there was anything they could do, if she wanted to talk. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the tarnished challenge coin, the one with the faded insignia worn nearly smooth by 18 years of her thumb moving across it. SEAL Team 3. Tikrit. 2009, the year the building came down. The year she learned that orders to disappear meant disappearing. The coin was heavy in her hand. It always had been. But that afternoon, it felt heavier than before. At 3:45 p.m., the front door opened. Her son Marcus threw his backpack onto the living room floor with the particular violence of a 6th grader who'd survived another day of middle school. He called out for her, "Mom? You home?" The way he always did, his voice carrying the specific tone of a child who still believed his mother was at work, still believed the world made sense. When he found her at the kitchen table, he stopped moving entirely. Brooke was still in her civilian clothes from the morning, still holding the challenge coin. Her eyes were red. Not from crying in the moment, she hadn't cried. But from hours of holding the tears back, of keeping herself absolutely still, of staring at the coin and knowing that the thing she'd spent 7 years trying to become had been erased in 17 minutes by a man in a suit who understood that the quietest threats are always the most dangerous. Marcus was 11 years old. He had his father's eyes, a lighter brown, warmer, less aware of what the world could do to you if you let it. He saw his mother at the table and his entire body understood that something fundamental had broken. "Mom." His voice was smaller than it had been a minute before. "Why are you home?" "It's only 3. You don't get home until 8. Brooke looked at her son and felt the full weight of 17 years of impossible choices pressing down. She couldn't tell him the truth. The truth was classified. The truth was sealed in Pentagon files under a name that didn't exist anymore. The truth was a building in Tikrit that had come down with 17 people inside, and a young girl, not yet Brooke Sullivan, not yet erased, who'd crawled through the wreckage and carried out an insurgent commander because staying alive was the mission, and the mission came first, and coming back meant vanishing. She couldn't tell him that his mother had been suspended for saving a life too competently, for moving with the precision of someone trained to end threats. She couldn't explain that she couldn't fight back because fighting back meant revealing that the woman he called Mom had once been something else entirely, and that revelation would put him in danger. She couldn't tell him that Dr. Caldwell had weaponized her competence against her, had taken the very thing that made her capable and reframed it as criminal. So she said nothing. She pulled him close. She let him put his head on her shoulder while he asked again and again what was wrong, what happened, why was she home early, and she held him without answering because the only answer was one she could never give. Outside, the San Antonio afternoon pressed down like a lid, 94 degrees, and climbing. The challenge coin sat on the kitchen table, catching the light in ways that made it gleam. In her pocket, her phone continued to buzz with messages from people who wanted to help and didn't understand that help from outside was the thing that had gotten her into this situation. Help meant exposure. Exposure meant the classified past becoming a not classified present. And a not classified present meant her son would learn what his mother actually was, and learn it in the worst possible way. Marcus finally fell quiet, just holding her, his arms thin and strong the way 12-year-old arms are, before they learn how to be cruel or how to be afraid. After a long time, he whispered, "Did something happen at work?" "Yes," Brooke said. It was the truest thing she could tell him. "Is it going to be okay?" She looked at the challenge coin on the table. She thought about the Iraqi man upstairs in the ICU at St. Michael's, alive because she had moved when everyone else froze. She thought about Dr. Caldwell in his office, 3 calls in the dark already converting her salvation into her destruction. She thought about Patricia Reeves building a case that would be ironclad because it was built on the foundation of the only thing Brooke had ever been truly excellent at, finishing the mission. "I don't know yet," she told her son, and meant it. 3 days into her suspension, the medics came through the ER doors at 4:41 p.m. on a Tuesday, pushing a stretcher that belonged in a trauma bay, not a regular hospital floor. Gunshot wound, abdomen, massive bleeding, the paramedic calling out vitals like a prayer no one was answering. Brooke wasn't supposed to be here. Her badge was in a drawer at home, next to the challenge coin. She'd been sitting in her car in the St. Michael's parking lot for 20 minutes, just breathing, unable to leave, unable to go home. When the medics rushed past, she moved on instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive in Tikrit, the same muscle memory that knew when to step toward danger instead of away from it. She followed them into the trauma bay. The patient's face was slicked with blood, his left eye swollen shut, but when the nurses rolled him under the lights and his good eye opened, it found her. Across 20 feet of sterile space, through the chaos of medical equipment and shouting orders, his pupil dilated with shock. He knew her. She knew him. The world went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze before anyone had even intubated him. His mouth moved. One word. Whispered. A word she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 18 years. Hyalet. Ghost. Her code name. Her identity. Her life before she was nobody. Tom Rodriguez, the hospital security guard, was standing 3 feet from the trauma bay entrance. 42 years old, former Navy Master-at-Arms, the kind of man who'd trained younger sailors until the day his knees gave out and the Navy gave him severance. He'd never asked questions about Brooke, never stared, never treated her like she owed anyone an apology for being small and quiet and competent. But he'd heard that word. He'd heard the reverence in it, the weight of it, and something in his face shifted like a door opening onto a room he'd been waiting 18 years to enter. He stepped toward her. Not hostile. Curious. The way a man looks when recognition is finally happening and all the pieces are clicking into place. "What was your rank?" he asked. Not, "Who are you?" Not, "I know something." Just that. Rank. Military. Present tense. Brooke stood motionless in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and she made a choice. She could walk out. She could disappear into the parking lot the way she'd been disappearing for 12 years, grinding through double shifts and inventory checks and humiliation at vending machines. She could protect the classified file and the redacted records and whatever was left of the official story that said Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan's existence had been erased on purpose. Or she could tell him the truth. Master Chief Petty Officer, she said quietly. Naval Special Warfare. Tom Rodriguez's eyes went wide. His hand moved to his chest, and his entire body shifted into something Brooke hadn't seen since 2006. He snapped to attention. Actual military attention. His voice dropped low and loud at the same time, carrying across the trauma bay like a command that couldn't be disobeyed. Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan on the floor. Master Chief on the floor. The room went still. Nurses froze mid-motion. The trauma surgeon who'd been ordering labs looked up. The patient on the stretcher, despite the gunshot wound and the blood loss, turned his good eye toward Brooke again, and this time there were tears streaming down his face. Tears that weren't about the bullet in his abdomen. Dr. Caldwell would have arrived within minutes. Would have seen this. Would have felt the shift in the room's center of gravity like an earthquake. But he wasn't there. He was at home, probably pouring a second drink, probably already anticipating Brooke's permanent removal from the roster, her references destroyed, her professional reputation salted so thoroughly that no hospital within 500 miles would hire her. He didn't know yet that the moment he'd activated Patricia Reeves' investigator, he'd set in motion the exact machinery that would dismantle him. Because Patricia Reeves had gone back through 18 months of supply orders. 18 months of digitized records, all the data Brooke had compulsively flagged in her inventory reports. Reeves was an auditor, not a nurse. She didn't care about hospital politics or how many senior doctors had called to vouch for Caldwell's character. She cared about numbers. She followed them the way a bloodhound follows a scent, and the scent led to MedSupply Incorporated, a company that had been billing St. Michael's for surgical equipment in quantities that made no medical sense. Thoracic retractors. Vascular clamps. Specialized instruments that any competent surgeon would have recognized as duplicative, unnecessary, inflated by 40%. The orders went back. And back. And back. Caldwell's wife had incorporated an LLC called Sterling Health Solutions on March 14 of the previous year, 6 weeks before the supply orders started inflating. Sterling Health Solutions was registered to an address in the medical district, for blocks from St. Michael's, in a building with 17 other shell companies. Within 2 weeks, Patricia Reeves had subpoenas filed. Within a month, Caldwell's attorney was answering the door with a briefcase and a sick look on his face. But the immediate moment in the trauma bay belonged to a different kind of truth. The patient was conscious enough to speak. His name was Amir Nasser, though Brooke had known him then as Commander Rashid, a man who'd orchestrated attacks on coalition positions from inside a compound in the Jolan district. She'd captured him during a night raid that had gone badly wrong in exactly the way black operations do, when the plan assumes the world is one thing and the world proves to be something else entirely. Rashid had shot her spotter, Sarah Chen, a young lieutenant with a 1-year-old daughter. The building had been collapsing, either from the firefight or from an airstrike that shouldn't have happened so close to ground truth positions, and Brooke had 2 seconds to decide whether to let a man she'd come to kill die under falling concrete or to pull him out. She'd pulled him out. Because that was who she was when it mattered. Not because she was good. Not because she was forgiving. But because she could, and because Sarah Chen's daughter didn't need her mother to be a widow just to settle a score with a man who'd already been beaten. Now that man, bleeding on a stretcher at St. Michael's, told the room exactly that. His voice was weak but clear, the kind of clarity that comes from knowing you're speaking a truth that changes everything. He'd spent 17 years in a refugee camp after the war ended. 17 years waiting for extraction. When it finally came, he'd been processed, vetted, admitted to the United States, and settled in San Antonio because the social services coordinator had family there. He'd lived quietly. Worked in construction. Kept his head down. And now, with a gunshot wound slowly being typed and crossed and prepped for emergency surgery, he was telling a room full of medical professionals that Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had saved his life when she could have let him die. She pulled me from the building, he said. After I shot her. After I fought her. She put a tourniquet on my leg and carried me to cover. She never hesitated. She never asked why. The trauma surgeon was looking at Brooke now. The nurses were looking at her. Tom Rodriguez, still at something close to attention, was looking at her. And somewhere in the system, Patricia Reeves was unraveling a spreadsheet that would end Dr. Caldwell's career before the week was out. The patient was wheeled into the OR. Brooke didn't follow. She stepped back into the hallway, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her mind already running through the hierarchy of truth. Some truths were classified. Some were buried by orders that couldn't be disobeyed. Some were held in the memory of a man she'd captured and released, who'd lived long enough to tell the world that the quiet nurse they'd tried to destroy had spent her life doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Within 72 hours, the auditor Patricia Reeves filed criminal referrals with the FBI. Within 96 hours, the board president who'd taken Caldwell's midnight call to destroy Brooke's credibility received a subpoena. The previous hospital's HR director admitted that yes, a Dr. Caldwell had called, and yes, she'd felt pressured to fabricate concerns about violent tendencies, and no, she'd never actually filed them officially because nothing about the call had felt legitimate. The medical board suspended Caldwell's license pending criminal fraud investigation. His attorney negotiated a settlement, full restitution of diverted funds, permanent license revocation, retirement from medicine, or prison. Caldwell chose retirement. Brooke was reinstated with back pay. The Pentagon, pressured by Rodriguez's quiet inquiries and the patient's public testimony, declassified her service record. The Navy Marine Corps Medal, awarded 18 years ago in a ceremony no one was allowed to witness, was officially reinstated in her personnel file. A new ceremony was scheduled. St. Michael's administration attended. The hospital board president shook her hand and said, "I apologize 3 times, each one quieter than the last." Her son sat in the 3rd row, and when they placed the medal around her neck, he was crying. That evening, he drew her a card. Construction paper. Crayon. The letters careful and large, "World's Best Mom." Brooke taped it beside her new employee badge, a laminated rectangle that looked identical to the one they'd taken away, except for one difference. The name read Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. 6 months later, she drove past a strip mall on her way to St. Michael's morning shift. A folding table. A hand-printed banner, affordable insurance, ask me how. Caldwell sat behind it in a wrinkled button-down, looking at nothing in particular. Brooke didn't slow down. She didn't look at him. She just kept driving, the challenge coin in her pocket, her son's drawing secured behind her ID badge, the weight of the medal around her neck a reminder of who she'd always been, even when the world tried very hard to make her forget. She parked. Walked through the ER doors. Tom Rodriguez was starting his shift at the security desk, and he nodded when he saw her, a nod that carried 18 years of deferred respect. In the break room, a new nursing student was being berated by a surgeon for a charting discrepancy. Brooke stepped in smoothly, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to give. "I'll handle the documentation," she said. "You focus on the patient." The surgeon backed down. Later that shift, a frightened teenager came in through the ER with a suicide attempt that he'd survived. His parents were in the waiting room, destroyed with guilt. Brooke sat with him for an hour, not speaking much, just being present in the way that people who've already died once know how to be. When she left, she told him something she'd learned a long time ago: the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. He looked at her like she understood something true. She did. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever kept your strength hidden until the moment it was needed most, please like this video and subscribe. Let us know in the comments, when have you seen quiet strength change everything? What would you have done in Brooke's position?